So I'd like to start out today talking about back in those days, those like 50 years ago, when if you're going to do genealogy, I had to go to a library and look at the books they had. You could order microfiche from them. You also could, as I mentioned before, you could actually have a number of newsletters in different areas of the United States, and a lot of them had little ads in the back of them saying, I'm working on this, and would you be interested in communicating? So one of those days, I was at the library and I was going through the magazines, and I was in Iowa, and I don't know if at that time if I even realized that a lot of the first research that I would be doing was going to be in Iowa. And as I mentioned yesterday, the family prior. So I knew my grandmother on my mother's side was a prior, but we were we weren't really around many of those people. They were older by the fact that they would be my mom's aunts and uncles, and a lot of them had passed before we even had a chance as a family to get to know them. So in this magazine, I went ahead and I got my stamp out and my envelope out and pen, and I wrote a little nice little request from this lady who was in the Iowa Genealogical Society, and she said she was also working on um, prayers. So at that point in time, it would take days for the letter to go out, days for the letter to be delivered, and then, you were at the mercy of whoever you were waiting to see how long it'd be. But I actually did. I received a notification from Lois Atkins was her name, and she was connected to the prior family and was interested in doing genealogy and very interested in, spending time with me, kind of as a beginner. So after that, we corresponded a little bit. I got to, know a little bit about her. And then I was living in Belen, New Mexico, which is a very small town south of Albuquerque. And the family, we were converting an old adobe house. And if you know anything about adobe houses, most of them have sand, and then you fill the sand in the room, and then you lay the brick. And we were doing a very, very complicated design of the bricks as we were doing it. But it meant that, we had dug out all this floor, and basically a lot of it was sand, and then the rest of it was kind of in this herring pattern brick. Well, so somebody knocked on the door, and I went to the door. It was this lady. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know if she was a neighbor or, whatever people, around that would be knocking on our door. But anyway, so she reached in her bag, that a little briefcase that she was carrying, and she said, I think that you and I have a, DNA connection. And DNA, even at that point, wasn't in part of the conversation like it is now. But she knew that, they were working on that. And so she handed me a picture, and I will combine the picture with this story video. And it was a picture of a man and a woman and these kids. And immediately I recognized one of the daughters as being, I called her Aunt Grace, which was my mom's aunt, and I actually had met her a couple times, but not real often. And but then I knew if that was the sister, and then I looked, and then I go, oh yeah, that. And I started identifying, but I realized, and I asked Lois, I said, when was this picture taken? And when she told me, I realized that my grandmother was part of that family, but she wasn't born yet. But it was very exciting, and both Lois and I think, were um, very excited to meet each other. I don't know what she thought about the sand floor. I think that it was probably a lot for her to take in, this family living in a house that has a sand floor. Um, anyway, she didn't stay real long, and her husband was in the car, and they were out doing some traveling, and they just happened to go out of the way to hand this picture to me. Well, that really, really started to open up more doors for me and identifying how Lois, was connected to me. So what it ended up was that Lois's grandmother, great grandmother, they were all connected in this way, but it was very you know not that immediate thing. It's not like, oh, I'm your first cousin. So as I put the information down, I had also requested information from another lady named Virginia. I don't think I remember what Baldwin was her last name. And so she was writing me also, and the information she was giving me was this direct link to this prior family that was in Iowa. And they gave me the county, and but it was interesting at the time because I was communicating to both of them in writing, in letters, and they both kind of had a difference of opinion about the father of the prior that would have been a direct connection for sure. I always knew the direct connection to Lois because of that picture. That was proof beyond doubt that she was definitely definitely related to us. And I stayed in contact with both of the ladies, and I always felt a little bit like it was kind of later I found out they call them brick walls, but, it was an area that was not going real fast in my research. So, what I found was is there were other priors in Iowa at the same time. And eventually I was able to find out information about um, Jessie Pryor, which my grandmother's name was Jessie, but her maiden name was Pryor. And even at that point, there was the discrepancy of the names being spelled in different ways. Some were spelling it Prior, some were spelling it Payor. I even saw one that was Pier, but it had been interpreted by somebody in Ancestry when I was doing research there, and I looked at the actual census report, and I could see the discrepancy. I could see the person who had handwritten out in the census report area in kind of a fancy writing, and so it was still a prior. So this added kind of to the confusion of that. And so many, many, many years passed, and I was still working. I wasn't retired at the time, but I decided that I wanted to leave and fly away to, leave Portland, Oregon, rent a car, drive all over Iowa until I made more sense of what this family situation was. So I rented my car, and I went immediately to where Lois was living. And then, of course, she was up in years at that time. I think she was the only last one of the youngest person in her family. They lived to be a long time. And as I expose more of this information, the detailed information for you, if you're interested, you'll see how many kids there were and her placement. But so she answered the door, and it was kind of a glass door. It wasn't a screen door, but it was a glass door. And I guess she thought I was selling something, or, she didn't look really pleased that I was at her door, and kind of wanted me to, explain this to her. So I reached into my bag and I pulled out an envelope that had her handwriting on it, a letter that she had actually written to me in New Mexico. And so, she was so excited that once she figured that out, she invited me in. By that time, I think her husband had been dead about 20 years, and she was living by herself in a very, very large house, and she had lots of rooms. And she wanted me to stay with her. She says, "Well, you got to stay at least 2 or 3 days just to review all the records." Well, I was on a little bit of a timeline because I was still working, but we did spend a lot of time. She had a lot of beautiful pictures. She had actually did a lot more. genealogy on her husband's side of the family, the McCormicks and Atkins, and leading up. But I think there was always this kind of this mystery about the Pryors. And eventually I found the Pryors in different areas, different ways, as far as especially census reports, and was able to know that I had up to that point the correct kids and the correct parents. However, when I went to find out something about one of the kids, I realized that the child was listed on the census report as ward of the court. So the other kids in that family were older, and they were able to more or less take care of themselves. And I found out from Lois that her relative in this family was named Mary, and Mary was old enough that she kind of, it was this very small town, a small area in Iowa. She was able to house and do house cleaning, and that's how she was able to kind of survive the situation. So right up front, it showed that the mother had died, and it was in 1870, which would have given the baby, the son that was the ward of a court, it would have showed him as about being 1 years old. Now, some records I found said that the father also died at the same time in 1970, and they mentioned a place where a lot of people either went to get married or they would vacation, and so I had this mystery immediately going into this and trying to put it together. So as of what we are saying and what I am saying today is that she this mother who died early, very young, with these four kids, and I knew what happened to Mary, and I knew what happened to Jesse and Frank, and and then I knew about Charlie's being a ward of the court. So I drove around a lot in that area. I went to cemeteries. I actually went to a church one day, and it was a cemetery behind a church, and somebody was out there at the church, and so I talked to them. They explained to me that in many of those cases, that those people would not be buried in the cemeteries because a lot of them were farmers and they had land, and so they actually had the tombstone and the body actually at the farm, which was basically private property. So it wasn't like you could drive up to this small cemetery and go out and check it out. Um, Anytime I had an opportunity when I was there, I was kind of talking to anybody that would talk to me in relationship to. There was like a little restaurant, and the first couple days, and I would always ordered the same thing. And then the third day, the cook actually came out and asked me, what was I doing? Because it was a very, very small town, and I really was a stranger to them, and they all knew I was a stranger. And so I explained to them, the situation. Now, the lady's maiden name, that the prior maiden's lady, Nellie, that her family, her dad was a Wilson, and her maiden name was Wilson. And I was able to get much more information about that side of the family, and found some beautiful, beautiful headstones that were put in place by the Wilson family. And I think he was in his 90s when he died, and it said he died in this a snowing sled accident, which I thought was interesting. You just never know what's going to pop up. But I have, to this day, 50 years later, have not been able to really pinpoint what kind of accident. Was it an accident that killed for sure the mother? But if the father wouldn't have been killed, now some people show in their records that the father was still alive. So I couldn't figure out why he didn't take care of the kids or find somebody else, in the family to take care of the kids, especially the little 1 year old. And he moved in with a family of Campbells, and so I've tried to check that out as far as where their family, um, and eventually the three boys were united, and from what Lois told me, though, Mary was always wondered what happened to her brothers. And she had heard some stories, but she really didn't know, and so there's a part of the records right now that I feel really pretty certain about. Um, However, there's still this discrepancy when you go in and check and you read other people's um, following, the paper trail and the different. I mean, it's very important that we do find all the most honest, up to date information, to hang our hat on. But it ended up that I have tracked some priors, and they had changed their spelling to the Payor, and they ended up in Canada. Actually, all three of the boys off and on ended up in Canada, so they were homesteading. So my mother's family, and Jesse was his name, also Jesse Pryor. He ended up going up into more into the Vancouver area of Canada, but I found records where he and one of his sons had actually left Canada, came back, and took over his citizenship in the United States. Now, that family and that mother and kids ended up kind of going out west and found they all moved together and stayed in contact a lot. And so I do have that. Um, I also have records that show that there was a prior right on the eastern border, middle part of Iowa. And I drove out there to the Mississippi River and drove around and looked for cemeteries. And it was interesting because Atkins, Virginia Baldwin, um, and Lois Atkins, they disagreed with each other's genealogy, and to this day, they both took them to her death that they were still uncertain for sure exactly where their ancestry really was able to be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. So I guess that's my brick wall still, and I have been successful in a lot of other areas and worked a great deal more on some than others. But this has always been something that has been, kind of on my mind, and I have pictures and of course then with my relationship with Lois, um, I would. When I left Iowa, I stopped again and talked to her, and we became, close friends. And I would call her. At that point, she was probably in her upper 80s, or maybe even um, in 90, just barely years old. And she just not died just a few years ago. And she had five daughters, and she explained to me, and I felt like I knew most of them, but I never met any of them, and none of them were interested in genealogy, she said. So, there was really no reason to kind of do that. But I would call her, and she was a fascinating lady. I mean, to be in the wild woolly west when she was a little girl and have that many brothers and sisters, and she would talk about big metal pails that she would go out and collect all these eggs, and all the bread that was baked, and all the, everything they went through, and the hard winters. And also she was in World War II, which was fascinating to me, and she talked a lot about that. And then she did after a while, when I started doing some research on her, I think she was even at the top level of the Genealogical Society for the whole state of Iowa. So she was a very intelligent. She was a school teacher for many years, and she teased me because she wanted to teach, but she said they wanted her to teach like the kids in high school, or in the upper years of school, because she didn't put up with anything. And so she was a little, it was a combination of the rough upbringing and living the way they had to live to survive with all those kids, and the combination of the war and her being in the war. I think that, I could tell she could probably take care of herself in a classroom of really high school students, but that's nothing compared to now what you have to deal with. But and she enjoyed that time. And then at that point, she was still living at the house. And the daughters made arrangements. I think one daughter might have came and visited her quite often, and then others, there was somebody that did her would come and cook for her at least one meal a day, or she could take care of herself still. And so it was not that long ago that I um, couldn't find her. I called the phone number and it said no longer in service. And so I know it was a small town, and so I started calling around to some of the nursing homes. There was only a few in the town, and started asking them questions if she was actually there or not. And I didn't really have, at that point, I didn't have any way of contacting her daughters to find out. And so to much avail, a lot of times they would send me to another nursing home, or they would say, oh, she was here, but she's not here anymore. And so eventually, after, many, many tries and everything, I did find that, yes, she was at that. And they said, but she wouldn't come to the phone because she was eating right now. And so I said, okay, I'll try back later. And then the next time she didn't really want to talk on the telephone, apparently, but they kind of said, no, this is somebody from out of town and you might want to speak to him. And it was kind of sad because we'd had such a wonderful, full out conversation, relationship, girlfriend type everything. But she didn't have her hearing aids on. She didn't like her hearing aids. And so she really couldn't recognize my voice. And finally she just got like kind of like angry almost, and she said that she did not like the pajamas that was delivered, and she thought I had bringing her pajamas and she didn't like them. And then as I was trying to explain more and try to figure out, how she was doing, she actually got a little bit irate about it, and she says, um, I'm getting nothing from this conversation. And then she hung up on me. And you know, knowing Lois, that was the way we said goodbye, and I'm not surprised. And I, I was happy I at least got to know kind of. And so then later after that, I actually contacted one of her daughters on Facebook, and she didn't answer me for several months. And then finally, she told me that yes, Lois had passed, and and then it was nice to have that true DNA connection, and to have the stories going back.